Rain drummed on the asphalt of a narrow alley between two nondescript brick buildings in the industrial district of Des Moines. It was 6:30 on a Tuesday morning, and the gray October sky barely let any light through the heavy clouds. Detective Raven James parked her patrol car near the yellow tape that had already cordoned off the crime scene from curious passers-by. Raven got out of the car, adjusted the collar of her dark blue coat, and headed toward a group of police officers surrounding a motionless figure on the wet asphalt. A few minutes later, she was joined by her partner, Detective Sebastian Brown, who had parked right behind her car. "What do we have?" Raven asked curtly, approaching Sergeant Davis, who was the first to arrive at the scene. "Danielle Sanders, 38 years old," the sergeant replied, checking his notebook. "She was a teacher at the elementary school on Maple Street. The body was discovered by a janitor at 5:20 a.m. when he came to take out the trash from the neighboring office building. One shot to the chest, apparently from close range." Raven crouched down next to the body, carefully avoiding the areas marked by the forensic team. The woman was lying on her back with her arms outstretched. She was wearing a dark green jacket, jeans, and white sneakers. Her face looked peaceful, as if she were simply sleeping in the drizzling rain. Her dark brown hair was scattered across the wet asphalt. "Does she have any ID?" asked Sebastian, joining the examination. "Her driver's license is in her jacket pocket," nodded Sergeant Davis. "No signs of robbery. Money, credit cards, everything's in her purse." Raven carefully examined the surroundings. The alley was narrow enough that two cars could barely pass each other. On one side was an old warehouse belonging to a stationery company, and on the other was a small office center. There were no security cameras in sight, making it the perfect place for a crime that no one was supposed to see. "Strange place for a random murder," Raven remarked, getting up and dusting the moisture from her knees. "There are hardly any pedestrians here after work. What was she doing here?" Forensic scientist Robert Hill approached the detectives, removing his rubber gloves. "Preliminary time of death is between 8 and 10 last night," he reported. "Caliber 38, clean through. No shell casings yet, the shooter may have picked them up. There are no signs of a struggle or resistance on the victim's clothing." "So she knew the killer, or he took her by surprise?" Raven wondered aloud. "Or both," Sebastian added. "We need to find out what brought her here last night." After the body was taken to the morgue and the crime scene was thoroughly processed, the detectives went to the victim's husband. The address listed on Daniela Sanders' driver's license led them to a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The house was a small, single-story structure with a neatly trimmed lawn and flower beds where the last autumn chrysanthemums were still blooming. The man who opened the door looked to be in his early 40s. He was of medium height with short graying hair and tired eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. He was wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. "Mr. Sanders?" Raven asked, showing her ID. "I'm Detective James, and this is my partner, Detective Brown. We need to talk to you about your wife." The man's face changed instantly, fear reflected in his eyes. "What happened to Daniela? She didn't come home last night. I was worried all night, but I thought maybe she stayed at her sister's." "May we come in?" Sebastian asked gently. They entered a small living room furnished with simple but comfortable furniture. Family photos hung on the walls, most of them showing Daniela with her husband at different stages of their life together. "Mr. Sanders," Raven began, sitting down opposite the man on the sofa, "I'm very sorry to tell you that your wife has passed away. Her body was found this morning." Robert Sanders froze, as if unable to comprehend what he had heard. For a few seconds, he just stared at the detectives, then his face turned gray. No, that's impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. "She was just supposed to... We had a fight over something silly, and she said she was going to her sister's to cool off." "Mr. Sanders, your wife was murdered," Sebastian said firmly but sympathetically. "We need your help to find the person who did this." At the word "killed," the man turned even paler. His hands began to shake, and a second later he lost consciousness, sliding off the couch onto the floor. Sebastian quickly jumped to his side, checked his pulse, and helped bring him to his senses. Raven brought a glass of water from the kitchen. "I'm sorry," Robert said weakly when he came to. "It's just, I can't believe it. We understand that this is a shock, Raven said, but we really need your help. Tell us about last night. Robert slowly sat back down on the couch, holding his head in his hands. We had dinner together around 7 last night. Then I watched the news while Daniela washed the dishes. We had a little argument. He paused, as if ashamed to admit something. What was the argument about? Sebastian prompted him gently. Nothing, honestly. She wanted to buy a new sofa, and I thought it was a waste of money. She got upset and said she was going to her sister Emma's to talk. She said she felt suffocated at home because of my stinginess. I thought she'd spend the night there, and we'd talk it over in the morning. When exactly did she leave? Raven asked. Around 7:30. She took her purse and jacket and slammed the door. I didn't even say goodbye to her properly. The man's voice trembled with suppressed tears. Tell us about your wife's sister, Sebastian asked, making notes in his notebook. Emma? They're twins, very similar in appearance, although different in character. Emma is married to Henry Clay. They live in the Highlands, on Oak Street. Daniela often went to see her when we had disagreements. Emma always knew how to calm her down. Did your wife have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted her dead? Raven asked. No, absolutely not, Robert exclaimed. Danielle was a teacher. The children adored her, her colleagues too. She was the kindest person I ever knew. No one could have wanted her dead. The detective spent another half hour with the widower, finding out details about Daniela's life, her habits, friends, and acquaintances. Robert told them that his wife had worked at Lincoln Elementary School for 12 years, that they didn't have children, but hoped that would change someday. He described Daniela as a quiet, kind woman who loved to read, cook, and spend time in the garden. We'll need a list of all your wife's friends and acquaintances, Raven said, standing up, and her sister and brother-in-law's contact information. Of course, Robert nodded, writing down the Clay family's address and phone number on a piece of paper. But you don't think Emma or Henry? We don't think anything specific, Sebastian replied. We're just checking all possible angles. Leaving the Sanders house, the detectives headed for the murdered woman's sister's home. The Highlands neighborhood was considered more prestigious than the one where Robert and Daniela lived. The houses here were larger, with more manicured yards and newer cars in the driveways. The house at the address Robert had given them was a 2-story colonial-style building with white columns and a red tile roof. There were no cars in the driveway, and the windows looked dark. Raven pressed the doorbell and waited. No one answered. She tried again, holding the button down longer this time. Silence. Maybe they're at work? Sebastian suggested, peering into the first-floor windows. At 11:30 in the morning? Of course they must be, Raven agreed. But it's strange that they don't know about Daniela's death. Robert said his wife was coming here, so they must have been supposed to meet. The detectives walked around the house and checked the backyard. Everything looked normal. No signs of a struggle or forced entry. The house just seemed temporarily abandoned by its owners. Let's try to find them at work, Raven suggested. They returned to the car, and Raven contacted dispatch, requesting information about Emma and Henry Clay's places of employment. A few minutes later, they received a response. Emma worked as an accountant at Midwest Transport, a logistics company, and Henry was a safety inspector at Iowa Metal Works, a manufacturing plant. First, they drove to Midwest Transport, a small company located in an office building in the city center. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with a neat hairstyle, looked concerned when the detectives introduced themselves. Emma Clay? She asked. Yes. She's been working in our accounting department for 4 years, but she didn't come to work today and didn't even call to let us know. This isn't like her at all. She's a very responsible employee. When was the last time you saw her? Sebastian asked. She left work at her usual time yesterday, around 5:30 p.m. She looked normal, nothing out of the ordinary. Has anyone tried to contact her this morning? Of course. Her immediate supervisor, Mr. Parker, called her home and cell phone several times, but no one answered. We're starting to get worried. Raven asked for Mr. Parker's contact information and arranged to meet with him tomorrow to find out more about Emma's work and her behavior lately. The next stop was Iowa Metal Works, located in an industrial area on the outskirts of town. The factory produced metal structures for the construction industry, and the air around it was filled with the sounds of machinery and the smell of metal. They were greeted at the personnel department by a human resources manager named James River. Henry Clay? Yes, of course. He's been working for us as a safety inspector for 7 years, he said, looking through the documents. But he's not at work today, and he didn't call in. That's very strange for him. Henry is extremely meticulous when it comes to work. How has he been acting lately? Raven asked. Normal. Although, to be honest, he's seemed a little tense over the last few weeks. His colleagues have noticed that he's been more irritable than usual, but he hasn't said anything to anyone. Did anyone try to contact him today? Yes, the shop foreman called him this morning, but his phone was off. We thought maybe he was sick and forgot to let anyone know, but that's not like him. Leaving the factory, the detectives drove in silence, mulling over the information they had received. A disturbing picture was beginning to emerge. One of the twin sisters had been murdered, and the other sister and her husband had disappeared without a trace, without even notifying their employers. What do you think? Sebastian finally asked when they stopped at a red light. I think Emma and Henry Clay know more than they're letting on, Raven replied. The only question is whether they're victims or perpetrators. The next morning, Detectives Raven James and Sebastian Brown began their day by compiling a list of people to interview. Over the past day, the Clay couple's disappearance had become increasingly mysterious. None of their neighbors had seen them since Monday, and their phones were still unreachable. Their first stop was Lincoln Elementary School, where Daniela Sanders worked. The school principal, an elderly woman named Barbara Hendricks, met the detectives in her office, which was decorated with children's drawings and diplomas. Danielle was one of our best teachers, Mrs. Hendricks said, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. 12 years of impeccable work. The children adored her, and parents always asked for their children to be placed in her class. Did she have any conflicts with colleagues or parents? Raven asked. Absolutely none. Daniela always got along with everyone. She was the kind of person who would smooth things over when there were disagreements. I just can't imagine who would want to harm her. The detective spoke to several teachers who worked in the same hallway as Daniela. All the feedback was equally positive. A calm, kind, helpful colleague who never participated in school gossip and was always ready to help. Did she seem normal yesterday? Sebastian asked music teacher Gloria Wright. Yes, completely normal. We even had lunch together in the staff room. She mentioned that she wanted to redo the flower bed in front of her house for spring. She didn't say anything about any problems or worries. After school, the detectives went to several of Robert and Daniela Sanders' neighbors. The picture was the same everywhere. A quiet, friendly couple who never caused any trouble. The neighbor on the right, elderly Mrs. Coleman, spoke especially warmly of Daniela. Such a sweet girl, she said, standing at the fence between the properties. She always says hello and asks how you are. When I was ill last winter, she brought me soup every day, and Robert helped me fix the porch when my husband was in the hospital. Did you hear any arguing or shouting coming from their house last night? Raven asked. No, nothing like that. Although I did see Daniela leaving around 7:30. She was walking to her car and looked a little upset, but nothing more than that. I figured she was probably going to her sister's. She did that sometimes. A very different picture began to emerge as the detectives began interviewing the Clay couple's acquaintances. First, they spoke with their neighbors on Oak Street in the Highlands neighborhood. The neighbor on the left, a middle-aged man named Donald Mitchell, who worked as a bank manager, was much more reserved in his assessment. Henry, well, he always seemed like a man of character to me, he said, adjusting his glasses. Not the type to compromise easily, and lately he's become even more withdrawn. Several times I've heard him and Emma arguing quite loudly. When was that? Sebastian asked. The last time was 2 weeks ago, late at night. I couldn't make out the words, but their voices were clearly raised. Emma came out into the yard crying afterwards. I didn't want to interfere, but it was clear that she was upset. The neighbor across the street, Ruth Phillips, confirmed Mitchell's observations. The atmosphere in their house has definitely been tense in recent months, she said, watering the flowers in her front yard. They used to seem like a happy couple, but something changed. Emma lost weight and looked stressed, and Henry became gloomy. Do you have any idea what might be causing their problems? Raven asked. I don't know for sure, but I suspect it has something to do with the fact that they don't have children. Emma is 38, and I think that upsets her a lot. Henry doesn't seem to want to discuss the subject. The next step was to visit the Clay couple's workplaces for a more detailed conversation with their colleagues. At the logistics company Midwestern Transport, the detectives were again greeted by a secretary, who then showed them to the head of the accounting department, David Parker. Parker was a man in his mid-40s, tall and fit with attentive brown eyes. He invited the detectives into his office and offered them coffee. Emma is an excellent employee, he said, sitting down at his desk. She's very attentive to detail, never late, rarely takes sick days. But lately I've noticed that she's become more distracted. Distracted in what way? Raven asked. Well, she's made a few small mistakes in her reports, which never happened before. A couple of times I found her crying in the bathroom. When I asked her what was wrong, she said she was just tired. Has she mentioned any problems in her personal life? Sebastian asked. Parker hesitated for a few seconds, clearly wondering whether to tell the truth. Between you and me, Emma has been staying late at work a lot in the last few months. Sometimes until 7 or even 8 in the evening, even though our workday ends at 5:30. She said that things were tense at home and she needed time to calm down before going home. Did she say what the tension was about? Not really. She only mentioned once that Henry had become very jealous and suspicious. She said he was checking her phone and demanding a report on every minute she spent away from home. After talking to Parker, the detectives visited the Iowa Metalworks factory where Henry Clay worked. Human Resources Manager James River led them to shift supervisor Thomas Green, who worked directly with Henry. Henry is a good worker, knows his job, said Green, a man in his 50s with calloused hands and a gray beard. But he has a difficult personality. Lately, he's become even more irritable than usual. Has he mentioned any family problems? Raven asked. Henry's not the type to share personal stuff, but you could tell something was bothering him. Several times I caught him calling his wife during work hours and talking to her in a rather harsh tone. He asked where she was, who she was with, and when she would be home. How long has this been going on? 3 or 4 months ago. And 2 weeks ago he came to work with broken knuckles on his right hand. He said he hit the wall in the garage while fixing his car, but it didn't look convincing. That evening, the detectives decided to talk to Emma Clay's friends. They got a list of contacts from her co-workers. The first one was Victoria Lewis, who, according to other acquaintances, was Emma's best friend. Victoria lived in a small apartment in the city center and worked as a manager at a travel agency. She was a woman of about 35, slim, with short curly hair and expressive green eyes. When the detectives introduced themselves and explained the purpose of their visit, her face became serious. I was so worried when Emma didn't answer my calls, she said, inviting the detectives into the living room. This isn't like her at all. Tell us about Emma, how she's been feeling lately, Raven asked. Victoria took a deep breath and sat down in a chair opposite the detectives. Emma was going through a very difficult period in her marriage. Henry had become unbearably suspicious and controlling. He followed her every move, checked her phone, and demanded explanations if she was even half an hour late from work. What caused this suspicious behavior? Victoria hesitated again, clearly unwilling to betray her friend's trust. Listen, Sebastian said gently, we're investigating a murder. Any information could be important in finding the truth. The thing is, Emma has an affair with her boss, David Parker, Victoria finally admitted. It's been going on for several months. Emma felt terrible about it, but she said David was the only one who understood and supported her. Raven and Sebastian exchanged glances. Parker hadn't mentioned the affair during their conversation, although he had had the opportunity to do so. Did Henry know about the affair? Raven asked. Emma didn't think so, but in recent weeks his behavior had become so aggressive that she began to suspect he had found out. She said she was afraid of his reaction if he found out the truth. Did she ever mention that Henry had threatened her? Not directly, but she said he was becoming increasingly unstable. He broke things in the house several times during arguments, and recently she came to me with a bruise on her wrist and said Henry had grabbed her too hard during another fight. When did you last see Emma? Sebastian asked. On Sunday afternoon. We met at the mall. She was buying groceries. She seemed very tense and said that things were getting worse at home. She even mentioned that she was thinking about divorce, but was afraid of Henry's reaction. Did she say anything about her plans for Monday evening? No, nothing specific. She just said she'd try to get home as late as possible to avoid another argument. After talking to Victoria, the detectives returned to the station to discuss the information they had gathered. The picture was becoming clearer. There were indeed serious problems in the Clay family related to Emma's infidelity and Henry's jealousy. "We need to talk to Parker again," Raven said, studying the notes in her notebook. "He's hiding important information from us." The next morning, the detectives returned to Midwest Transport. This time, David Parker looked noticeably more nervous than during their first meeting. "Mr. Parker," Raven began sternly, "yesterday we learned some details about your relationship with Emma Clay that you didn't see fit to mention." The man's face paled and he lowered his eyes. "I didn't know how important it was to the investigation," he muttered. "Let us decide that," said Sebastian. "You tell us the truth about your relationship with Mrs. Clay." Parker took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. "Yes, we had an affair. It started 4 months ago. Emma was going through a difficult time in her marriage, and I had recently divorced. We spent time together after work, and gradually it grew into something more." "Where did you spend this time?" Raven asked. "Usually in cafes or restaurants. She came to my house a few times. We knew we were doing wrong, but we couldn't stop." "Did her husband know about your affair?" Emma thought not, but in recent weeks she had become very nervous. She said that Henry had become overly suspicious, constantly checking her phone and demanding explanations for everything. "When did you last see Emma?" Sebastian asked. "On Monday, at the end of the workday. She said she was going home, but she looked very upset. I offered to drive her, but she refused, saying she needed to sort things out at home." "Did she mention any plans for the evening?" "No, she just said she might go to her sister's if things got too tense at home." "Mr. Parker," Raven said, standing up, "you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Daniela Sanders and involvement in the disappearance of Emma and Henry Clay. You have the right to remain silent." "What?" Parker exclaimed, jumping up from his seat. "You have a motive," Sebastian explained, handcuffing him. "Emma may have threatened to break up with you and return to her husband. You may have decided to remove the obstacle." "You're wrong!" Parker shouted, as he was led out of the office under the surprised glances of his colleagues. At the station, Parker was placed in a holding cell, and then detectives conducted a formal interview with him in the presence of his lawyer, whom he had called. "Tell us about your plans for Monday evening," Raven said, turning on the tape recorder. "I went home right after work, around 6, Parker replied, nervously adjusting his tie. "I made dinner, watched TV, and went to bed around 11. Can anyone confirm your alibi?" "I live alone since my divorce, but I can provide surveillance footage from my home if it helps prove my innocence." "Are you really saying you never met Daniela Sanders?" asked Sebastian. "I swear. Emma sometimes talked about her sister, but they rarely saw each other. I only knew she had a twin sister, but I never met her." Parker's lawyer, an elderly man with gray hair, leaned toward his client. "Mr. Parker is cooperating fully with the investigation," he told the detectives. "He is prepared to provide all necessary evidence of his innocence, including surveillance camera footage and statements from neighbors." "We will verify all of your statements," Raven promised. "In the meantime, you will remain in custody as a prime suspect." After the interrogation, the detectives remained in the office to discuss the case. "What do you think?" Sebastian asked, leafing through the interrogation notes. "He's either a very good actor or he really had nothing to do with the murder or disappearance," Raven replied. "But he definitely has a motive. If Emma decided to return to her husband or end the affair, he could have become desperate." However, both detectives felt that something about this version didn't add up. Too many questions remained unanswered, the main one being, where were Emma and Henry Clay? Detectives Raven James and Sebastian Brown spent their third day of the investigation trying to find additional evidence against David Parker. Technical experts were already reviewing CCTV footage from his home, and forensic scientists were examining his car for traces of gunpowder or other clues. So far, nothing concrete had been found, but the detectives weren't giving up hope. It was around 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon when they returned to the station after another search of Parker's home. Raven was driving, thinking about the contradictions in the case, when she suddenly heard the sound of cars approaching at high speed. "What the hell?" she muttered, looking in the rearview mirror. 2 cars were speeding down the road toward the station. The first, a dark blue sedan, was clearly trying to shake off its pursuer, a gray car. Both cars were traveling well above the speed limit, and it was obvious that the first car was heading straight for the police station. "Sebastian, look!" Raven shouted, slamming on the brakes at the side of the road. In the next second, the dark blue sedan crashed into the metal fence in front of the station entrance at full speed. The sound of grinding metal and shattering glass echoed throughout the street. The gray car skidded to a halt at the wrecked fence, and a large, dark-skinned man in his 40s with an angry face jumped out. A woman climbed out of the mangled sedan, which was smoking from the impact. Even from a distance, it was clear that she was injured. She was holding her left shoulder, and blood was running down her face. The woman staggered, but stubbornly moved toward the entrance to the station. "Emma, stop right there!" the man shouted, rushing after her. Raven and Sebastian instantly jumped out of their car and ran toward the scene. Other police officers also began to rush out of the building when they heard the crash. "Police, stop!" Raven shouted, pulling out her gun. The man paused for a second when he saw the weapon pointed at him, but then rushed back toward the woman, who had almost reached the entrance to the station. "Henry Clay, you're under arrest!" Sebastian shouted, also drawing his weapon. Henry stopped a few meters from Emma, breathing heavily and clenching his fists. His face was contorted with rage, and fresh abrasions were visible on the knuckles of his right hand. "She's lying!" he shouted, pointing at his wife. "Everything she tells you is a lie! She cheated on me and destroyed our family!" Emma reached the steps of the station and turned to her husband. Her face was covered in bruises, her left eye was almost closed from swelling, and her lip was split. She was breathing heavily, holding her injured shoulder. "He killed my sister!" she cried through her tears. "He hired a hitman to kill me, but he got us mixed up!" "Shut up!" Henry roared, taking a step forward, but stopped when he saw several police officers pointing their guns at him. "Get on the ground!" "Hands behind your head!" Raven ordered. Henry slowly dropped to his knees and then lay down on the asphalt. Sebastian quickly approached him and handcuffed him, while Raven helped Emma to safety inside the station. "Call an ambulance!" Raven shouted to the sergeant on duty. "We have a wounded woman!" Half an hour later, Emma was examined by an ambulance doctor. She had multiple bruises, a cut lip, a possibly broken rib, and a dislocated shoulder. The doctor insisted she be hospitalized, but Emma refused, saying she had to give a statement first. Henry was placed in a holding cell, and Emma was taken to an interrogation room. Despite her injuries, she was conscious and ready to tell her story. "Mrs. Clay," Raven began gently, "we know you've been through a lot, but we really need to hear your side of the story." Emma nodded, accepting a glass of water from Sebastian. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "It all started 3 weeks ago," she said. "Henry found messages on my phone. I left it at home when I went to work, and he decided to check it. There were messages from David, my boss." "How did he react to this discovery?" Sebastian asked. "At first, he didn't say anything. He just became even colder and more suspicious. He started following my every move, checking my phone every night, demanding explanations if I was even 15 minutes late from work." Emma took a sip of water and continued, her voice growing more confident. "And then, a week ago, he asked me directly about the affair. I couldn't lie and confessed. Henry flew into a rage. He yelled that I had disgraced him, that I had destroyed our family. He even hit me, for the first time in 8 years of marriage." "What happened next?" Raven asked. "For the next few days, he was strangely calm. He hardly spoke to me, but he didn't yell either. I thought he was just thinking things over, maybe deciding whether to file for divorce." Emma paused, gathering her thoughts. The detectives waited patiently. On Monday morning, as I was getting ready for work, Henry suddenly told me that everything would be fine, that he would take care of the problem and we could start over. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. "Tell us about Monday evening," Sebastian asked. "I came home at the usual time, around 6. Henry was home, which was strange because he usually comes home later. He seemed nervous, constantly looking at his watch. And then the phone rang." Emma paused again, her face pale with the memory. It was a man's voice, unfamiliar. He said, "The job is done. The woman is dead." Henry replied, "Are you sure it was her?" And the voice said, "Of course, dark hair, green jacket, just as you described." The detectives exchanged glances. The picture was beginning to come into focus. "What happened after that call?" Raven asked. Henry hung up and looked at me with a strange expression on his face. Then he said, "My God, what have I done?" I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I had a terrible feeling. Did he explain what had happened? Not right away. At first, he started pacing around the room, repeating, "It's not her. It's not her." Then he told me the truth. He hired someone to kill me. He gave him my description, told him I'd be wearing a green jacket and would be leaving the house around 8 in the evening. Emma began to cry, wiping her tears with trembling hands. But the killer didn't know I had a twin sister. Daniela also wore a green jacket. We bought matching ones last year. She was walking to her car to go home, and the hitman thought it was me. "What did Henry do when he realized his mistake?" Sebastian asked. He panicked. He said that if the police started investigating, they would definitely find him, that he needed time to come up with a plan. When I said I was going to call the police immediately, he smashed my phone and wouldn't let me leave the house. "He held you hostage?" "Yes. First, he locked me in the bedroom. The next day, when he realized I was going to try to escape at the first opportunity, he took me to an old abandoned house outside the city. He kept me tied up there, coming twice a day, morning and evening, to bring me food and water." Raven took detailed notes, recording every detail of Emma's story. "Where exactly is this house?" "About 20 miles north of town, near the abandoned Miller farm. It's a small one-story house with a partially collapsed roof. Henry said that a distant relative of his used to live there." "How did you manage to escape?" Sebastian asked. "Henry came in particularly agitated this morning. He said that the police had arrested a man on suspicion of Daniela's murder and that this was good news for us. But he also said he couldn't risk me ever telling the truth." Emma shuddered as she remembered that moment. "He brought a gun with him. Henry said he had to finish what he started, that he would do it quickly and painlessly." "But how did you manage to escape?" Raven insisted. "When he untied the ropes on my legs to take me away from the house to kill me, I kicked him in the groin as hard as I could. He doubled over in pain and dropped the gun. I grabbed it and ran to the car." "Did you have the keys?" "Henry left them in the ignition. He didn't think I could get away. I started the car and drove here to the station. But on the way, I saw him following me. I don't know where Henry got another car, maybe he stole it, but it was him." "Why didn't you stop somewhere along the way to ask for help?" "I tried, but he was too close. He tried to ram my car from behind several times. I realized that the only safe place was here, at the police station, so I just stepped on the gas and drove straight here." Emma finished her story and leaned back in her chair, looking exhausted. "Mrs. Clay," Raven said, "we'll need to go to the abandoned house you described to look for additional evidence. We'll also need your sworn statement." "Of course, I'll do whatever is necessary," Emma nodded. "But what about David? My boss? You understand now that he's innocent, don't you?" "Mr. Parker will be released today," Sebastian assured her. "Your testimony completely clears him of suspicion." "And Henry?" "Your husband will be charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder," Raven replied. "With those charges, he could face life in prison or even the death penalty." Emma covered her face with her hands and began to cry. Despite everything she had been through, it hurt to realize that the man she had once loved had become a murderer. "I never thought he was capable of this," she whispered through her tears. "Yes, he was jealous and controlling, but murder. I never thought he could kill someone, especially my sister." People are capable of many things when they feel they are losing control of a situation, Sebastian said philosophically. The important thing is that justice will prevail. Meanwhile, Henry Clay sat in a holding cell. When detectives came to question him, he no longer tried to deny his guilt. The presence of a court-appointed lawyer did not change his decision to cooperate with the investigation. I didn't plan to kill Danielle, he said, staring at the table. I didn't even know her very well. I saw her a few times at family gatherings, that's all. But you hired a hitman to kill your wife, Raven stated. Yes, I found this man through an acquaintance at the factory. I paid him $5,000. I gave him a description of Emma and told him she left the house around 8 in the evening wearing a green jacket. What's this man's name? Terrence Walker. He works as a docker. I thought I could start a new life after that, find a woman who would be faithful to me. And when did you realize that it wasn't your wife who had been killed, but her sister? Henry sighed heavily. Walker called and said the job was done, but when I realized that it was Danielle who had been killed, not Emma, I knew there had been a terrible mistake. What made you keep your wife hostage instead of just turning yourself into the police? I panicked. I thought that if Emma told the truth, I'd be locked up for life. I hoped the police would find another suspect. Henry looked up at the detectives. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I never meant to hurt Danielle. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. A mistake that cost an innocent man his life, Sebastian said sternly. By evening, David Parker had been officially released from custody. All charges against him were dropped, and he received an official apology from the police department. Henry Clay remained in custody awaiting trial, and Terrence Walker was arrested at his home 2 hours after Henry gave his name. Raven and Sebastian finished filling out all the necessary paperwork late in the evening. The case was closed. The killer had been found, the motive established, and all those involved in the crime arrested. Good work, partner, Raven said, putting the folders with the documents in the safe. Thanks, you too, Sebastian replied. It's just a shame it took us so long to find the real culprits. Parker spent almost 2 days in a cell. But now Emma is safe, and justice has been served, Raven concluded, turning off the lights in the office.